All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the story of one of England's most legendary figures, the warrior king Henry V. I mean, this guy is an absolute icon, right? He's the symbol of English military power, a national hero made immortal on the stage. But here's the big question. Was that legend, the wild prince who suddenly became the perfect king, the whole story? Well, let's peel back those layers of myth and find out who the real Henry V actually was. So our story starts not with some party-loving prince, but with a teenage commander who was already facing the brutal realities of war. You know, Shakespeare gave us this unforgettable character, right? The wild Prince Hal, getting into trouble with guys like Falstaff. But the truth? It was, well, a lot less theatrical. In reality, from a very young age, Henry was neck-deep in war and politics, a total world away from the rowdy teenager we see in the plays. And I mean, this wasn't just some abstract political game. This was brutally real. At just 16 years old, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, Henry was shot in the face with an arrow. Think about that for a second. For pretty much anyone else back then, that would have been it. Game over. So what happened next is just incredible. The royal physician, a guy named John Bradmore, basically invented a new surgical tool on the spot. He created these special tongs that could screw into the arrowhead lodged in Henry's cheekbone and pull it out without doing even more damage. And it worked. But it left Henry with these intense facial scars for the rest of his life, a permanent physical reminder of what he'd been through. Okay, so you've got this young, battle-scarred prince who finally takes the throne in 1413. And what does he do? He doesn't sit back and relax. Nope, he immediately looks across the English Channel and sets his sights on France. Now, this whole thing hinged on an old and pretty controversial family claim to the French throne. Henry decided to bring it back. For him, it was kind of two things at once. His royal duty for sure, but also a golden opportunity. See, France was a mess at the time, politically speaking. Their king, Charles VI, was suffering from these terrible bouts of mental illness, and the court was totally divided. Henry saw his opening, and he decided to go for it. And that brings us to 1415. Henry launches his invasion of France, and what happens next becomes one of the most famous, and let's be honest, one of the most improbable victories in all of military history. His army had just captured the town of Harfleur, but it came at a huge cost. They were sick, probably with dysentery, they were exhausted, they were in bad shape. And yet, Henry makes this incredibly risky call to march his men all the way to Calais, an English-held port. He's basically marching them straight into the path of a massive French army that's coming to stop him. And just look at the mismatch here. It really puts the desperation of the English situation into perspective. On paper, they had absolutely no chance. The French were well-fed, well-rested, and they seriously outnumbered the English. They were totally confident this was going to be an easy win. But Henry was a brilliant tactician. He used the battlefield itself as a weapon. It had rained heavily the night before, turning the field into a muddy mess. This narrow, bogged-down terrain was an absolute nightmare for the French knights in their heavy armor. They couldn't charge. They just got stuck, and that made them easy targets for the English longbowmen. The result? A shocking, total victory for the English. It completely changed the course of the war and made Henry a legend back home. And that incredible victory at Agincourt, that was the turning point. It gave Henry the momentum he needed, and for the next 5 years, he pressed his advantage with devastating effect. See, Henry was smart. He took full advantage of that divided French court, which was basically in the middle of a civil war. This allowed him to do something no English king had ever managed before. He wasn't just conducting raids. He was systematically conquering Normandy, piece by piece. And this all culminates in the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This was his ultimate victory. The treaty basically disinherited the French king's own son and named Henry V as the regent of France and the heir to the throne. He would also marry the king's daughter, Catherine. So with the stroke of a pen, he had legally united the crowns of England and France. He was, by law, the future king of both. So at this point, Henry is at the absolute peak of his power. He's won it all, the future king of 2 nations. But his story is about to take a sudden and very shocking turn. He was only 35 years old. Just 2 months before he would have officially become King of France, Henry V died. most likely from dysentery he picked up while on campaign. And his sudden death just blew everything up. It created this massive power vacuum, leaving his son, who was just a 9-month-old baby, to inherit this incredibly fragile and contested kingdom of both England and France. So when we look back, his legacy is, well, it's complicated. On one hand, he was a military genius. He really helped forge a strong sense of English identity. He was even the first king since the Norman conquest to use English in his own letters. But on the other hand, he could be incredibly ruthless. Think about the order to kill the prisoners at Agincourt. And his lifelong ambition, his war in France, ultimately led to decades more conflict and helped create the instability back home that would eventually explode into the Wars of the Roses. So how do we remember him? England's greatest hero? Or a king whose entire identity was defined by war? He was devout, he was brave, and he was unbelievably successful. But everything he achieved was built on conflict and conquest. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What was the true cost of all that glory? And what kind of king would he have been if he'd actually lived long enough to rule the 2 kingdoms he fought so hard to win?